Imagine a land not yet tamed, a vast, echoing canvas of mountains and deserts stretching to a horizon that promised endless fortune and unforgiving death. This was America in the mid-19th century, a nation reeling from civil war, yet simultaneously gripped by an almost messianic zeal for expansion. The frontier beckoned, a siren call to fortunes unimaginable, to destinies forged in sweat and steel. And at the heart of this unfolding drama lay a singular, audacious dream to stitch the continent together, east to west, with ribbons of iron. This was the era of manifest destiny, not just as a political doctrine, but as an almost spiritual imperative, a drive that would birth both unimaginable wealth and profound moral compromise. Into this crucible of ambition stepped four men, an unlikely quartet known to history as the Big Four. There was Leland Stanford, the shrewd politician and former grocer, whose public gravitas masked a ruthless pragmatism. Collis P. Huntington, the hard-nosed hardware merchant whose fierce business acumen made him the undisputed financial brain. Charles Crocker, the burly, relentless contractor, a man whose sheer force of will could move mountains or armies of men. And Mark Hopkins, the quiet, meticulous bookkeeper, the conscience, or perhaps simply the calculator, of the group. They were not born into privilege. They were self-made men, hungry for opportunity, and united by a singular, all-consuming vision, the Central Pacific Railroad. But this wasn't just about building a railway. It was about conquering the impossible. The formidable Sierra Nevada range, a jagged wall of granite and ice, stood between their dream and the riches of the Pacific. This was the ultimate engineering challenge of its time, far exceeding anything the fledgling nation had ever attempted. How do you carve a path through solid rock, suspend tracks over dizzying chasms, and battle blizzards that bury entire camps? The magnitude of the task was staggering, and the financial risk even more so. Initial investors scoffed, and Wall Street turned its back. Only a handful of true believers, or perhaps true madmen, saw the potential. The first spark of conflict wasn't a sudden explosion, but a slow burn, fueled by the staggering odds and the intoxicating promise of power. To achieve their dream, the Big Four needed more than just grit. They needed capital, and they needed political muscle. This is where the nascent American political system, still finding its footing after the war, became a malleable tool in their hands. Through relentless lobbying and, undeniably, through the judicious application of influence and outright bribery, they secured unprecedented federal land grants and government bonds. Thousands of acres of public land, stretching for miles on either side of the proposed tracks, these weren't just for the railway itself, but for the timber, the minerals, the future town's empire of resources granted before a single rail was laid. With this incredible backing, the Central Pacific began its westward crawl from Sacramento in 1863. But the cost was immense, not just in dollars, but in human lives. Crocker, with his demand for relentless progress, oversaw an army of laborers. Initially, Irish immigrants, then overwhelmingly Chinese workers, were brought in by the thousands, desperate for work, yet subjected to conditions that would shock the modern conscience. They were paid meager wages, often less than their white counterparts, and forced to perform the most dangerous tasks, blasting tunnels through granite, working in sub-zero temperatures, dangling precariously from cliffs. Their lives were cheap, expendable in the relentless pursuit of progress and profit. This was the brutal empire beginning to take shape, built on the backs of the exploited, fueled by an almost pathological drive for completion. The Big Four operated with an unshakable conviction, seeing themselves not as exploiters but as pioneers, nation-builders, yet their methods were undeniably ruthless. They formed powerful trusts, engaged in monopolistic practices, and systematically eliminated competition, often by simply buying them out or crushing them under the weight of their superior political leverage. Their burgeoning wealth afforded them mansions, private rail cars, and an influence that permeated every level of California politics. They dictated terms not just of commerce but of government, turning California in many ways into Stanford State, a corporate fiefdom masquerading as a democracy. Consider the parallels today, the early days of Silicon Valley, When tech giants built their empires with revolutionary ideas, but also through fierce competition, sometimes questionable labor practices, and an intense lobbying effort to shape regulations in their favor. The Gilded Age railroad barons were the original tech titans, transforming the landscape and economy with unprecedented speed, often leaving a trail of ethical dilemmas in their wake. They were the architects of a new American reality, one where corporate power could rival and often surpass that of the state. But what happens when such immense power, built on the suffering of so many, begins to exact its own price from its architects? As the Central Pacific pushed relentlessly eastward, forging an empire of steel and money, one must wonder, could such brutal wealth ever be truly benign, or would its shadows eventually fall upon those who amassed it? The tracks were being laid, connecting a nation, yes, but also laying the foundation for a deeply conflicted legacy, a question mark hovering over the very soul of American capitalism. The Golden Spike at Promontory Summit, Utah, on May 10, 1869, was supposed to be the triumphant culmination of a national dream. East met west, an impossible feat achieved, a continent forever changed. Leland Stanford himself wielded the ceremonial hammer, an iconic image of American ingenuity and perseverance. But for the Big Four, this wasn't an ending. It was merely the beginning of an even grander, more audacious empire. With the Transcontinental Railroad complete, the real game began: consolidation, control, and the ruthless monetization of their unparalleled achievement. The tracks laid through granite and sacrifice now served as the arteries of their vast, insatiable enterprise, pumping wealth directly into their coffers. No longer just builders, Stanford, Huntington, Crocker, and Hopkins transformed themselves into railroad kings. They expanded their dominion southwards, establishing the powerful Southern Pacific Railroad, effectively encircling California and extending their reach across state lines. The Central Pacific and Southern Pacific, often operating as one, became an almost living entity. An octopus, as it was famously dubbed by critics, its tentacles reaching into every corner of Californian life. From the grain fields of the Central Valley to the bustling ports of San Francisco, every product, every passenger, every economic transaction was subject to its will. Was this the inevitable consequence of such a monumental undertaking, or a calculated grab for absolute power? The escalation of conflict was not marked by battles, but by the slow, grinding oppression of economic power. Farmers who had to ship their produce to market faced exorbitant freight rates, often higher than shipping goods across the entire continent. Small businesses struggled to compete, as the railroad often owned the very land their competitors would need or simply refused them favorable rates. Land, once a promise of independence and prosperity, became a tool of the railroad. Settlers discovered that land grants, ostensibly for homesteading, were often held by the railroad, which then sold it back at inflated prices or simply denied access. The dream of California, for many, was turning into a nightmare of corporate subjugation. The Big Four, insulated by their immense wealth and political connections, seemed untouchable. They controlled state legislatures, influenced judicial appointments, and even handpicked newspaper editors. Opposition, when it arose, was swiftly crushed, and politicians who dared to challenge the railroad found their careers abruptly ended. Legal battles, though sometimes won by brave individuals, were ultimately lost to the railroad's endless resources and influence. This wasn't merely corruption. It was a systemic redefinition of power where private enterprise dictated public policy. How could a democratic state function when its core infrastructure and economic arteries were owned by a single, self-interested entity? Public resentment simmered, then boiled over. The Grange Movement, a national organization of farmers, found fertile ground in California, uniting against the octopus. They demanded fair rates, land reform, and an end to the railroad's stranglehold. Editorials railing against the lords of the rail became common as mass meetings and protests were held, giving voice to a populace feeling increasingly disenfranchised. The stakes were no longer just about profit margins. They were about the very soul of California, about whether it would be a state governed by its people or by its most powerful corporation. Leland Stanford, once the popular governor, now faced public scorn, even as he continued to accumulate staggering wealth and influence. His vast fortune, built on federal subsidies and human labor, afforded him a life of unimaginable luxury, sprawling estates, private train cars, art collections that rivaled museums. But this opulence stood in stark contrast to the hardship faced by many Californians, highlighting the chasm between the railroad's immense prosperity and the struggle of those who fueled it. Was this the American dream realized or perverted? The human cost, too, continued to mount. The Chinese laborers who had blasted tunnels and laid tracks were now largely discarded, facing discrimination and violence in a state they had helped build. New waves of workers, drawn by the promise of California, found themselves similarly exploited, paid paltry wages for back-breaking work, their aspirations swallowed by the ruthless machinery of the railroad. The wealth that flowed into the hands of the Big Four was, in an undeniable sense, stained by the sweat, blood, and tears of thousands. This era echoes eerily in our modern world. Consider today's tech giants, once hailed as innovators, now facing scrutiny over their vast power, their influence on politics, their control over data, and their labor practices. Are we witnessing a similar pattern of unbridled ambition leading to unprecedented corporate dominance, where the lines between public good and private gain blur to the point of disappearing? As the 1880s dawned, the Big Four stood at the zenith of their power, an economic and political force unlike any seen before in America. Yet, beneath the veneer of invincibility, seeds of discontent had been sown and an unspoken tension began to build. The question lingered, could such an edifice, built on such foundations, truly endure without personal consequence for its architects, as the stakes were about to become intensely personal? The railroad empire of the Big Four had reached its zenith. Leland Stanford, Collis P. Huntington, Charles Crocker, and Mark Hopkins, once ambitious merchants, now controlled a vast network that dictated California's destiny. They commanded immense wealth, lived lives of unparalleled luxury, and wielded political power that seemed unassailable. Yet beneath the veneer of invincibility, the seeds of resentment, sown by their ruthless methods and monopolistic practices, continued to fester. The octopus may have connected a nation, but it had also, in the eyes of many, strangled the very spirit of the Golden State. The question that had lingered, could such brutal wealth ever be truly benign, or would its shadows eventually demand a reckoning, was about to be answered not through public uprising, but through an intensely personal tragedy. In 1884, Leland Stanford and his beloved wife Jane embarked on a grand European tour with their only child, Leland Stanford, Jr. Little Lay, as they affectionately called him, was their pride and joy, a brilliant and inquisitive boy of 15, destined to inherit their vast fortune and perhaps redeem their controversial legacy. They envisioned him taking the reins of the railroad, perhaps even becoming president of the United States. But in Florence, Italy, a sudden, merciless wave of typhoid fever struck the boy down. Leland Stanford, Jr. died in his parents' arms, his future extinguished in a foreign land. The man who had moved mountains, built empires, and bent legislatures to his will was utterly powerless in the face of this devastating personal loss. This was the decisive turning point, the core conflict's unexpected convergence. The railroad baron's brutal empire, built on ambition and often indifference to human suffering, suddenly collided with an unimaginable personal grief. For Leland and Jane, the world stopped. Their immense wealth, their power, their influence, none of it could bring back their son. The driving force behind Leland's relentless accumulation had always been his family, his desire to build an enduring dynasty for his heir. With little gone, the very purpose of his monumental achievements evaporated. What now was the point of all the money, the mansions, the railroad? In the depths of their despair, a profound transformation began. Legend has it that Leland turned to Jane, uttering words that would forever alter the course of history. "The children of California shall be our children." This wasn't merely a statement of grief. It was a radical reorientation of purpose, a desperate attempt to transmute unbearable sorrow into something lasting, something good. Their personal tragedy would become the catalyst for a world-changing institution. They would not build a monument of stone, but an institution of learning, a university that would educate the youth of California and, indeed, the world in memory of their son. And so, Leland Stanford Junior University was chartered in 1885, opening its doors in 1891. The irony was palpable. The wealth that had been amassed through the cutthroat practices of the railroad, through the exploitation of laborers and farmers, through political maneuvering and monopolistic control, would now fund a beacon of knowledge and opportunity. This was not a simple act of charity. It was a colossal act of atonement, a desperate grapple with legacy. Could the creation of such a powerful instrument for good retroactively cleanse the means by which its capital was acquired? It's a question that continues to challenge us when we examine the philanthropy of titans throughout history. The founding of the university was far from easy. Leland Stanford died in 1893, just 2 years after the university opened, leaving Jane Stanford to face immense challenges. The Panic of 1893 crippled the nation's economy, drastically reducing the value of the Stanford estate, which was largely tied up in railroad stock. Furthermore, the federal government, seeking to recover debts from the Central Pacific, launched legal battles against the estate, threatening to bankrupt Jane and consequently the university. She fought tirelessly, battling both financial ruin and the powerful forces that still resented the Stanford name. For years, she poured her own personal funds into the institution, selling her jewels and managing the estate with an iron will, ensuring that her son's legacy would not perish. Her resilience, often overlooked, was as instrumental to Stanford's survival as Leland's initial vision. The university itself was revolutionary for its time. It was non-sectarian, coeducational, a rarity in higher education, and emphasized practical, applied knowledge rather than just classical studies. This foresight laid the groundwork for its future, though no one could have predicted the profound impact it would have. As the 20th century progressed, Stanford University became a hub for scientific research, engineering, and innovation. Its proximity to the growing electronics industry, fueled by returning World War II veterans and Cold War defense contracts, proved to be a fertile ground for collaboration. Professors and students alike ventured into entrepreneurship, taking the university's research and turning it into groundbreaking companies. This nexus of academia, research, and business gave birth to what we now know as Silicon Valley. The very land upon which Stanford University stands, once part of the vast Stanford estate, became leased out to fledgling tech companies. Hewlett-Packard, Varian Associates, and countless others found their beginnings in the orbit of Stanford. The legacy of the Big Four and their brutal wealth had morphed, through grief and philanthropy, into the forging of the global technological heartland. Consider the profound irony and the enduring lesson. A railroad baron's ruthless pursuit of profit and power, a pursuit that caused immense suffering and resentment, ultimately seeded the innovation engine of the 21st century. The legacy is not simple. It's a complex tapestry woven with threads of exploitation and enlightenment, of human greed and transcendent generosity. In our modern age, we see echoes of this dilemma. Contemporary billionaires, having amassed fortunes through disruptive technologies and sometimes controversial business practices, now engage in unprecedented philanthropy. It forces us to ask, can truly transformative good ever fully absolve the sins of its creation? Or does the shadow of its past remain, a constant reminder of the complex, often contradictory, nature of human achievement and legacy?